Good evening, everybody. Today we have some sort of seminar lecture. First of all, I would like to introduce you to my guests for today, Sven Gerst. He's a philosopher with some kind of interdisciplinary background in philosophy, economy, politics, having studied at King's College, London School of Economics and Politics, the University of Mannheim, worked at Harvard and Duke universities in the United States, as well as at the National Taiwan University. Yeah, impressive background. And Mr. Julius von Freytag-Loringhoven, who is well known for us, I mean, the liberal community. He's the head of the Naumann Foundation for the Baltic States. And me, Raimundas Lopata, director of the Instituto Liberalis. As it was mentioned before, the event will be held in English. I guess that there are no problems for those who are joining us. And let's start opening the floor for Sven, sorry.
Oh, good.
So go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And I also know that when I present such ideas online, I don't want to make it like a 45-minute or an hour lecture, but instead I give a little bit of impulse, and then we can enter into a discussion. Let's see how it goes. Because the question that you gave to me was rather provocative. How can we make liberalism sexy again? Or was it ever sexy? And whenever I asked about this particular question, I feel like I enter like Slavoj Žižek territory. Because when you talk about sex and political theory, it immediately becomes kind of, you talk about something physical, you talk about something passionate, primal, tribal. And usually I have the immediate hesitation and I say, well, thinking about a political theory in this particular way, like physical, passionate, raw, primal, like I reject that, right? Like I want the political theory to be the opposite of that. I want an enlightened, rational, grounded, principled, disempathetic to a certain degree kind of approach to the world, because otherwise we get into the things that we had way too much in human history. So I hesitated when people asked me, talk a little bit how to bring the sex appeal back to liberalism, because like liberalism is really unsexy by definition. It is an Enlightenment Immanuel Kant kind of idea. If you know one thing about Immanuel Kant, he's probably the least sexy person ever. So having said that, when people ask me that question for the first time, I thought it's nevertheless a helpful question to think of where liberalism is at the moment. And liberalism at the moment is at a very peculiar place because we fell out of fashion very quickly. So the historical moment where liberalism has succeeded, everybody knows the Fukuyama thesis is since I think the progress was after the beginning of after the end of the Second World War, building of international institutions, then really skyrocketed with the fall of the Iron Curtain. And that's where we can talk about the liberal moment for the last 2.5 decades, roughly. But in that short period of time, we already fell out of love. And that kind of reminds me a little bit of this relationship dynamic of the meme of the one person looking to the other, like they are like holding hands with one person. I think some of the viewers might know the meme, two people holding hands, a couple, and then the guy is looking over the shoulder to the other ideal. And that's at the moment, I guess, the populists. So to speak, liberalism has been kind of the good boyfriend that fell out of fashion very quick. And I think there are various reasons. And so thinking about it in terms of relationships or in terms of sex appeal might actually help more than I was initially accustomed to do it. So I will actually contextualize it with that metaphor. So as I said, liberalism kind of fell out of fashion and people fell out of love with it. They entered into this relationship with liberalism. I would say there was a huge momentum for adoption of liberal democracy, liberal market economy in the early 1990s and then 2000s until roughly the great financial crisis. And that's the first time when in a relationship you see that things get tricky and the doubts are creeping in. And I think what we have seen since 2008, that a lot of numbers that we could indicate as people's relationship with liberalism fall out of fashion. So we have seen peak globalization in 2008. We have seen now a decline of liberal democracy. We see that liberal values amongst young people fall out of fashion. I saw today a poll coming out of Polish high schools, and in Polish high schools, the most prominent political party was Konfederacja. In the past, I would have always said that young people are really in this like long arch of justice, you know, like the end of history, that they would always be liberals. Now we see it at the far right, you know, it's not only the populists, not the Peace Party, it's literally Konfederacja who is like the strongest. So there is this strong backlash in all the numbers that we see. And so I think we have to ask ourselves that question: why did people fell out of love with this idea of liberalism? And again, thinking in terms of relationships might actually help. So what I will do now in talking, I will break things down first to what makes a political theory appealing. So how could we actually get people back? What would make us basically sexy without like overplaying that card? And the second is, maybe in some countries we are still the golden retriever boyfriend. I think people in some countries, they haven't fully turned their backs on liberalism.
Like Lithuania. Lithuania is not a country that is as illiberal as many other European countries have turned, for sure.
Or like Canada is getting back on track, if we think about it. So I don't think that everywhere we have seen that, okay, liberalism is a done deal. Although I feel that in some countries, liberalism enters like the irrelevancy. And that's like really falling out of love.
That's Germany in the moment, for example.
Exactly, like nobody misses kind of the FDP at the moment. That's like the worst. Again, sticking with this relationship metaphor, we broke up, there's not this toxicity. Instead, it's like, you know, I moved on. You know, yeah. It's like I moved on. And I think I worry that this is something where liberalism could end in certain societies. So I think we need to work back on what makes a political theory attractive. And then second, in the other societies, how do we become this golden retriever boyfriend, to speak in the metaphor? Like, how do we deliver in the relationship? So first I will start a little bit by what makes a political theory attractive or sexy, so to speak. And you can jump in whenever you want, but I think there are like 6 rough categories. And as with everything in political philosophy, it's not like very harsh categories. These have some overlaps. I mean, there's not like strong conceptual clarity between all of those. This is like just rough heuristics. But I think there are 6 of them. The first one is the overall narrative, the storyline that you give to something. Like in a relationship, everybody has like kind of the moment, how you got together and where it is going. There's always the narrative, like, you know, the first meeting kind of point.
The historic narrative.
It could be the historic, but also could be in the future, right?
Like utopia.
Utopia, for example, like I think that's a point Hayek always makes, like an attractive political theory. He talks about it in the Intellectuals and Socialism. He says an attractive political theory needs to give you a utopia. Hence the appeal of socialism, right? Because you know what you're marching to, like literally. But any political theory needs to have kind of a narrative, like a storyline where it is coming from and where it is going, right? It's not like isolated data points. And I will contextualize a little bit more in a second. In the storyline category, I think emotions play a big role, and the symbols and the slogans. So again, like I always think like MAGA or Donald Trump makes always good showcase how it works on the other side. They have a very clear storyline, what led to the deindustrialization of America, strong emotions of the elites, anger, stuff like that, and symbols, you know, like drain the swamp is a very clear, symbolic, mythical reference, the red cap and whatnot. So for liberals, and I immediately contextualize that, for liberals, our storyline historically have been that we are avant-garde and the future gets better by the day. I think the overall narrative of liberalism has always been, well, progress is there. If you trust us and if you trust liberalism, we will get better by the day. And that has always been the promise of liberalism. Like the world gets better, and not only materially, but in terms of its scientific conditions, like scientific progress, creativity, technological progress, but also human rights, social progress, minority inclusion, and the like. So the world gets better by the day, so to speak. If I ask you, like, would you have preferred to live in 1500 or now? Obviously now. 1760 or now? 1830 or now, 1930 and now, certainly now, 1960s or now, 1970s or now, you know, and so on and so forth. But and here you can see the trouble. If you think about the question for millennials and Gen Z, if I ask them, was the world better in 2006 or now, they become a little bit more hesitant. Or let's say 2015, before whatever it is, Corona, like we have multi-crisis now, you know, war in Europe, Corona, now the whole restructuring of the world order. This appeal that always was there, that the world gets better by the day, that storyline is broken. And again, anchoring it to the narrative of the relationship, if I'm with you and it's not clear that we will get better by the day, our relationship is progressing, the doubt seems to creep in, right? Mm-hmm. And liberals have not countered that. So this storyline is broken at the moment that the world gets better by the day, and actually it seems like we are in one of the slumps, and we have had them historically. It's just like how to set up the narrative again. But then the whole emotional framework collapses. Our emotional framework is optimism. Mm-hmm. But the emotional framework of the day, the zeitgeist, is all pessimism. Like it started with Greta Thunberg and the climate protests, and we didn't really know how to react to that. But the overall vibes of the day is pessimism rather than optimism. So our narrative is broken, the emotional component, the emotional metastructure is broken, and we don't have a symbol. Like for a while, people said, like, yeah, but Elon Musk, you know, like he will drive us out of this. Oh boy, were we wrong on Elon, you know? So yeah, our symbols, our cultural references don't work. So this whole first narrative is dead. Yeah, kind of our own Steve Jobs would be there. Like it's hard for me to come even up with a symbol of somebody who represents that spirit of optimism, progress. We will conquer the world that is not morally corrupt, like Elon Musk or something. You know,
I would say Victoria Schmidt-Nielsen, but.
Yeah, for sure, and every remark that I make is so far on a global context, on the meta level of liberalism. But I think for each society there could be different anchor points, right? There needs to be also a local story to be told. Because I think, for example, like a society I know better, maybe than Lithuania, is like Poland. The storyline of the world gets better by the days very much holds true if you look at material conditions for Poland in comparison to Germany, where we actually see for now a couple of years that things are not only stagnating but getting worse. So that's the kind of first anchor point. A political theory, to be appealing or sexy, so to speak, must have a story arc that works with the right emotional package and the symbols. And again, for liberalism, we see that kind of collapsed. Kind of out of nowhere, and we don't have a second backup plan. Although I might talk about that later, how we get out of this mess. Then identity. Any good political theory gives that makes it appealing has always an identity structure, and I think that matters especially in the late stage capitalism world, or that we are living right now through, where we are more seeing the breakdown of traditional communities, at least in some societies, that religion plays a much lesser role, cultural associations play a much lesser role. People have studied that a lot. Also, of course, in the liberal tradition, people like Putnam, but also Fukuyama have studied that a lot. The consequences of those identity groups falling out. And a good political movement, an attractive one, not good, I distance myself from that, but an attractive political movement provides you with that form of identity. So the question is then for liberals, where is the identity? The MAGA group in the United States certainly has that. But where is the identity group of the liberals? Well, often we let ourselves be defined by the outside, by the external, and that's always the most dangerous. But the populists usually define who are the identity groups of the liberals. They say, you are the party of elites, or the movement of the elites, the technocrats. And if you look at it, I mean, if we conceive as the European Union as some sort of liberal project, as at least broadly conceived, then who represents that? Technocrats and elites. And that is the reflection of what the political enemies of liberalism would say. But is there a counter identity that we would spin? Historically, liberalism has always been this avant-garde, progressive, very urban, I must say, movement that broke things out. So it had a kind of tight-knit identity group. Different societies.
So there was also always the kind of more agricultural, more countryside kind of liberalism as well, as the kind of reflection of kind of just society trying to communicate about the economy and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it depends, I guess, on the different societies and whatever the movement consists of. But if I look at Richard Cobden, who invoked the Corn Laws, like a follower of Adam Smith, this comes more out of the, as you said, agricultural, like economics-focused groups. But again, it was avant-garde, right? It was like challenging the status quo. Our identity group is we want to defend the status quo in many cases, right? Nowadays, and I think that makes it unattractive, right? Like if you are the status quo, you become by definition unattractive. Like as
we're kind of the new conservatives as liberals, because we want that liberal democracy and market economy and global trade remains, and that is not an appealing thing if we say it should remain and things should stay the same, right?
I think so too. Like, it must be a question for liberals to answer. Are we the new conservatives? I think in terms of not political party success, I think we have to always take out political party success from ideological success. Like, for example, I'm a member of the Free Democratic Party in Germany. And like, I have to say, Germany is a very liberal country, but the Liberal Party does very badly, you know? So we have to dissect these two things. And so you can be very successful in terms of the zeitgeist, in terms of the values that people hold, and not very successful politically, because for political success, you need even more things than I list out here. You need like proper movement building, and you need like good leadership, kind of a nose for what is the political issue of the day, and leadership, as you said. Maybe I can talk about that in a bit, but so far I talk about it broadly as an idea. And as I said, Germany is a very liberal country. Like liberalism, like liberal values are deeply held. And by liberal values, I mean a liberal democracy. I mean the rule of law. I mean upholding human rights, religious toleration, political tolerations, things like that are quintessential, and that have been huge achievements of liberalism. But anyways, coming back to my initial point about identity, I think our identity is at the moment not really defined. Who classifies sociologically as liberal? We don't have like an edgy group. We don't have it tightly knit. It's unclear whether it's more of a mainstream thing. It is more of an urban, hip milieu, whether it is for example, in Germany, a more like middle class phenomenon. Is it really an elite project? Is there something like a commoner's project of liberalism? Very unclear. And that's because we have been a big tent ideology for a long period of time. If you ask many people, it is even conceived as liberal if you are very on the social democratic side of things, or sometimes on the very conservative but economically minded things. It's very big tent, right? And that kind of creates problems with identity in the long run. So that's kind of the second. What is our identity markers? And like the MAGA movement shows you very clear what are identity markers for them. Then the third point, what makes the political theory attractive, sexy? I think it's the aesthetics. What are the vibes? What is the intellectual coolness? Do we have the intellectual edge in many of the discussions? And here I just like pose a question also to you, but everybody who's listening. What do we have in terms of our political edge over any other political ideology? Does liberalism have cutting-edge solutions to questions in climate, artificial intelligence, housing,
war in Europe,
war in Europe, or how to respond to the trade war? I think we are like unarmed, or like disarmed when it comes to, like in this case, literally, when it comes to these questions. We have been kind of caught off guard, and we always have to go back to Adam Smith or John Locke to answer these questions for us. But like we need you, John Locke's and John Stuart Mill's, to answer these kind of questions, because I feel like liberals have become like the old uncle at the table who sits down and says, makes the cultural reference too, you know, these old outdated thinkers that are not answering questions that we have today. So if I ask a liberal, what do we think about artificial intelligence, the future of work? Like we could not reference like one person. Like in the past, especially I think
one person here should answer this, because you were running the future committee in the 2050.
Yeah. So and here, like if I would ask you, like and again, you don't have to answer right now, but it would be interesting. Who would you staff if you had to bring the 20 most bright liberal thinkers in the world together. And that's what they did, by the way, during the Mont Pelerin moment and after the end of the Second World War. They brought the Milton Friedmans, the Hayeks, the Mises of the world together, Karl Popper, to talk about these issues. And I doubt that we have these 20 thinkers today that are ready at our fingertips to answer those questions for us.
Yeah.
They are not there. We have been intellectually bled out, and it's our discourse is not shaped in that particular way. So we lost all kind of coolness when it comes to that. So that's kind of the aesthetic. I think our aesthetic is currently very beige, very backwards, maybe a little bit of hygge, like we are feel good. Well, world will get better, you know, like we just have to sit that one out to a certain degree. Then the fourth one is the cognitive appeal. Cognitive appeal, what I mean by that is, I think an interesting idea always has a dialectic between simplicity and complexity. So you need to be counterintuitive, because if you're just simple, like raw populism is unappealing in the mid-run to long run, because if you just give simple solutions, everybody will get that it's pretty dumb. What is interesting is the dialectic between elegant simplicity but counterintuitives. Like that's what people hope with Donald Trump. They hope that he's not so stupid to launch this trade war, which literally harms the US. They think he's playing 4D chess because they are waiting for the counterintuitive, that something great will emerge out of all of that nonsense, right?
Yeah.
And it could happen. Like, I don't, you know, like maybe he has the grand master plan how like entering into that trade war will give him the edge in terms of trade relations and the bond market and whatnot. But what I wanted to say is, liberalism was always very strong on the counterintuitive and weak on the simplicity and the elegance of its messaging. But right now we don't have both. We don't have either a counterintuitive message to the questions of the day. Maybe we have it a little bit for climate. I must say there is something there, I feel. But for questions such as migration, artificial intelligence, housing, the topics of the day, even the culture war, we don't have the counterintuitive. We are like, here's our message for the culture war, which is like free speech and like basically end of discussion. But what else is there, right? So I don't think we have the cognitive appeal. We feel like even intellectually dead. And that's the worst thing. Again, to stay in the relationship metaphor, we are really intellectually bled out to a certain degree. Mm-hmm. So then the last 2 points, the fifth, and they come a little bit together. The fifth is any interesting, appealing political theory has to have what I call a movement infrastructure. So the faces, the leadership, who are they, and how do we carve them out? So of course, if we look at the heights of classical liberalism, or like this kind of blend between conservatism and classical liberalism in the 60s, 70s, and so on, like Thatcher and Reagan and stuff, the typical Cold War liberals kind of come to mind when people think about like great leadership, right? Then Justin
You mentioned in your last conversations that you asked your students to name prominent liberals.
Yeah.
And what was the answer you received?
Justin Trudeau often comes up. Zelensky comes up as one of the leaders, but a lot of people really struggle to really name who are the charismatic liberals or the liberal leaders of the day. For philosophers, of course, people, again, a reference to people like Fukuyama and others, but again, like Fukuyama, no offense, I really enjoy Francis Fukuyama's work, but there must be a new generation of thinkers going on out there, and the same with political leaders. Justin Trudeau, like literally is history now, and there must be some other phase of liberalism. And then also, what is our pathway to develop these leaders, right? What is our infrastructure where they appear? What are the podcasts? What is the kind of what Gramsci called the metapolitics? Like, where in cultural spaces are leadership of liberals taking place? For example, if I want to be in a in the presence of the leaders in terms of progressivism, I would go to some cultural fair or art project. That's where they are hanging out, right? But we don't have cultural spaces where liberalism dominates, besides the bureaucracy, maybe, you know, where we are still dominating the discourse, right? This kind of neoliberal agenda. So that's something to think about. Where are our leaders, our faces, what are the rituals, and what's the infrastructure behind it? And then lastly, and that's like really now the final cultural assessment, to be interesting on the dating market, and I had to feel that many times myself, you have to be ingrained in the zeitgeist. So you have to understand what is the current vibe. You have to speak with the terminology of the people. Mm-hmm. So the words I just threw in for you, like vibes and stuff, you were looking at me, what kind of nonsense is he talking about right now? But like, if you want to appeal to the zeitgeist, you have to talk the language of the people right now, and you have to feel that you are fresh enough to have the vocabulary to engage with it.
Yeah.
And I think here's an example what I mean where liberals really fall out of place. When liberals talk about what they complain about, they still reference frameworks such as, oh, this guy's a socialist. The whole debate of socialism versus capitalism is kind of settled, you know, like that's what I call boomer politics. We moved into a different politics now, where it's the liberals versus the populists, for example, where different vocabularies, different political ideologies floating around. The old school Corbyn style socialists, they're kind of gone. We have, again, we are in different forms of ideological realignments, and we have to find our vibes, the right vocabulary to talk about these issues with the right people. And here we lack the forward thinking. Instead of developing our own memes and lingo and so language, we appropriate it from the political enemy and hope that it works. But we kind of come across as kind of the outdated uncle. I give you an example. There's in liberal European circles, they have the Cap, make trade great again, you know? And like, I love that messaging, you know, don't get me wrong, but like I appropriated from the political enemy, twisted it with a message that I feel is like currently a little bit anyways, like under attack, and hope that works. But it overall feels like, okay, boomer, you know, like the Cap is with its claim representative of something that falls out of fashion or out of date, and that's not what we want to be. So to close things off, I hope I summarized a little bit of my thoughts of why liberalism is currently so unattractive, because of all of those things that make for an attractive political theory, for attractive theory in general, namely a good overarching storyline, identity markers, the right aesthetics, a cognitive appeal of the dialectics between simplicity and complexity, people's infrastructure, and the right vibes, so to speak. We all fail to deliver, and if we don't, then people break up with us, and again, have been there, done that. That is very harsh. And I always hope that there is a return, and I hope for liberalism that there is a return. But there's also the chance that liberalism literally goes to the dustbin of history, and there will be other forms of ideologies that emerge. Our political enemies are already talking about post-liberalism. Patrick Deneen has a book on post-liberalism. Yeah. He thinks we have moved on, and like I'm clinchy. I don't want the people to move on. So
yeah, I mean, what's so interesting is that you said that the zeitgeist is not for optimism, but for pessimism. And you did like your 6-point analysis, how deep the hole is we sit in as liberals. I would argue that luckily there's nuance and it is different everywhere. I would say that of course the elections before this one, liberalism in the political representation in parliament looked in Lithuania even better than it does in the moment, because you had 2 liberal parties. But when you look at the appeal of the liberal movement, you can argue that they have not lost kind of their electorate and their voters. So you can also argue that we still have kind of like strong leaders from the liberal spectrum. I mean, now of course, when you're the Secretary General of NATO in the moment, then you also have as Mark Rutte to appeal to Donald Trump, and that makes you less attractive as a liberal leader in Europe. But you have Kaya Kallas driving the foreign policy agenda of the European Union as a liberal, picking up the fight against Putin, and she is an iconic, the one person people know from the European Commission apart from Ursula von der Leyen, I think, and Kubilius as the defense commissioner here, of course, well known. But so there is these kind of like, there is still a lot of potential hope and successful stories to tell, or you could still, even in Slovakia, where Fico kind of is on the trip to trying to transform the country into an Orban kind of populist spin dictatorship, and then still you have kind of there now the strongest resistance in our current polls from a liberal party that would in current elections get 50% of the vote. So there is something happening at the same time that does not all look that grim.
No, I mean, obviously, as I said, I'm very much in tune, I think, with the zeitgeist by being very pessimistic, right?
Yeah.
Because
the fact is that all the reasons or criteria you applying is a reality.
Yeah,
it's a reality.
Yeah,
especially what concerns the lack of pro-liberal intellectuals. We face them here in Lithuania. Terrible problem.
Yeah, and maybe just to throw in why this matters so much, because like people always have criticized and said, oh, you liberals are anyways too academic or like too intellectual, but no movement can be too intellectual. You need intellectuals in this kind of what I call the mosaic of social change.
Yeah.
You need a hardcore political movement. You need a party with party leaders. Okay, granted. You need a youth movement. Granted. You need cultural elites. Granted. But you also need intellectuals that adjust the ideas for the current time and then disseminate these ideas. Gramsci always called this like the cultural hegemony, and you only achieve this by having an intellectual base. And I think we bled intellectually out also because there was a creeping kind of skepticism that we are, because of our messaging, too academic or too intellectual, too elite. And that has kind of harmed the formation of a new intellectual class, where we said, oh, we had enough of the sweet talkers, like people like me, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, we need the people who are good at communicating. And I think there's a false dichotomy that now falls to a certain degree onto our feet, because the populist far right, they are not making this dichotomy. They are funding their own public intellectual structures, they fund their party structures, they fund all different things of the mosaic properly. For example, in Hungary, I think they just funded with the Comenius Institute, like it received huge grants. I don't want to give false numbers, but like people can look it up. This we are talking huge sums here for their think tanks and for their intellectual classes. Similarly, the Donald Trump needs somehow an anchor point, like the Patrick Deneen's or the Heritage Foundation, like they carve out and they churn out these ideas for him. Whether he adopts them is a different thing. Like I think we all expected something else from Trump too. But nevertheless, there is this kind of infrastructure out there, and we kind of downplayed it. And maybe in the end, we were too complacent. Maybe long story short here, why did we end up with this situation? Why am I so pessimistic? Because everybody who has a long relationship history, as I might have, knows that if you become too complacent in any relationship, it will end. People will fall out of love, and liberalism has become too complacent, too lazy in terms of politics, in terms of meta-politics, in terms of intellectualism, and that's where we are right now. So I have, of course, other things I could add, but like I'm opening it a little bit to you guys.
It's interesting in the conversations among Russian intellectuals. It was always the question, "Kto виноват?" Who's guilty? And of course, we see lots of the guilt, of course, on us. But the question is, what is to do?
The old Lenin question.
Yeah. And I mean, in a way, you laid out a good basis, because when you think about what Das Kapital of Karl Marx is, then it is first a problematic, pessimistic assessment of reality, unfortunate, very unfortunate how clear their idea was what is to be done, because that caused lots of harm. But I think we need to search kind of like what is to be done. Do you have answers on that?
I mean, of course, that's the billion-dollar question, and like above my pay grade. But I think I see some formation of interesting trends of what is to be done. I always say, like, okay, what are the bigger grand liberal projects that I see globally? And I think I always point out like two ways people could go, and they're very recent. One is that people could look into, that's the kind of abundance liberalism of Ezra Klein. That's an American focused context, but it's an old debate. So abundance liberalism basically says we can manage a lot of problems that we have by kind of accelerating technological progress. So that's like very the essence, right? And it's an old liberal story, but it says, well, the regulatory state has held us back for the longest period of time. We need state reform, proper managerial state reform, and then we solve the big problems such as housing, climate change, migration, or whatever through technological progress. Okay, and
so that's the old Progress Party.
The revival of the old story arc, but then it finally fits. Like the analysis, what goes wrong, over-regulating the regulatory state. I think there's a couple of interesting books. Ezra Klein's Abundance book is very interesting. Again, I think even more timely for example, the European Union rather than the US, because they complain about the red tape, bureaucracy, regulatory state in the US. But if you apply this kind of thing to Europe, I think it's really an agenda that could fly with a certain milieu, at least in Europe. So that's kind of the first, and it would revive this kind of techno optimism that was also is still a considerable amount of people that believe that. Like I think in the Trump camp, there's also these kind of people there, like the Silicon Valley type, the Elon Musk before they turn dark, kind of Thiel, Mark Andreessen. Like there's in any society these people who want to get things done that have not fully gotten out of the kind of neoliberal paradigm that we can get better. And I think that is a good basis. So the abundance liberalism, that is maybe the closest easy relationship fix. And then, of course, there is the dark temptation of Millet and going into the more populist direction and really rethink what style of politics do we want to have. And I think, you know, Javier Millet really hangs out with the wrong people, but mainly because I guess he was an outsider himself and nobody believed in him. But if I look at the numbers, like Argentina is like one of the success stories we really need to study. For example,
economically, or
Millet only focuses on economics, obviously. So, but why is this relevant? For example, Elon Musk wanted this Doge, right? Government efficiency, and could be an interesting project for many liberals to actually tell people, okay, like we have good ways of building back the regulatory state. And Doge, obviously, absolute.
Seems like an absolute
failure. Yes. Yeah. But Javier Millet put an MIT economist with Federico Sturzenegger in office, and the way he goes through things, it's a miracle. Like that, like he does by some same playbooks as Elon Musk, for example. The ministry publishes twice on Twitter a day, which kind of regulations they have rolled back. But I mean, they show very transparent in a very transparent way how you can roll things back, and economic growth, poverty rate falling down, inflation going down. That's like good statesman policy. You would not expect that from Javier Millet, but Millet forming the right alliances has, at least in this realm, given him a lot of leeway, and the turnaround is almost historical. Somebody has to show me numbers of a different country that has experienced such a turnaround, but it comes with a couple of very unpleasant conclusions, and that is, for example, the way we do politics. In terms of the aesthetics, I have a hard time to ever find something good in Javier Millet. The way he speaks, the way he calls out the elites, that's very repugnant to me as a typical bürgerlich, which is the German word. It's a bourgeois sentiment to a certain degree, right? Because he also insults them and stuff like that. But on the other side, it seems to be more catering to the vibes of the day. He's a contemporary phenomenon. Only for Argentina, he could not work, for example, in for example, Western Europe or something like that. But there could be adjustments that we could learn from what I call the dark liberalism side of people like Javier Milei. At least an interesting.
The problem is, I mean, I believe also that
he's the bad boy, just to stay in the relationship analogy.
Yeah, but I find Javier Milei a bad boy, but a believer in some kind of economic liberalism. He is to a high degree. Yeah, he believes in this kind of let's let people do their own economic thinking, and let's reduce state influence on that. But we have the examples but the problem is with this kind of populist sentiment is that populists always crush institutions, and populists want to rule. And then comes the temptation of power, and then you have exactly the kind of former liberal leaders, because don't forget, Viktor Orban used to be a member of our liberal family.
Yes.
The same is true about the leader of the ANO party in Czech,
Babiš.
Babiš. So there is this thing that the liberal turning populist can, in these cases at least, be little liberalism left at the end.
Sure, 100%. And I would not, like, my talk is, like, my point was not to say, oh, Javier Milei is kind of the roadmap, but what can we learn from him, right? I think there has been a shift in contemporary politics that says, well, rapid movement is possible again. Like the Trump 100-day agenda, the Javier Milei agenda to refocus in 100 days, that is possible. People are very fed up with we telling, or like not me, but like politicians telling them things take time. Yeah. And the incremental change of liberalism can still happen, but we have to speed that up. There is a sentiment of accelerationism out there that I think we should embrace, and that we can learn from Javier Milei. Javier Milei wants to get things done. Like, again, an example from Sturzenegger, from the ministry. Sturzenegger has, again, it's ruled by decree. The Ministry for Government Transformation was created only for a year. So he has on his wall a calendar, how many days he still has left. And so the urgency is there. And I think that has changed a lot from the sleepy, not sleepy Joe, but sleepy liberalism that we have encountered.
Of the European institutions.
Of the European institutions, but also the
democratic white paper. No.
White paper, exactly. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I think people are very much fed up with that. And like Javier Milei tells us a little bit the story of, well, this has changed. And the vibes is like, I do it with carajo, you know, and with pace. And I think we have to learn from that. If we want to get the support back of our liberalism as a also politically organized theory or ideology, needs to deliver, right? And the liberalism aspect needs to be carved out. And here we cannot just dismiss, or like maybe Milei will turn dark. That's why I call it dark liberalism. It's like a really walking on the edge, but theoretically, at least inspirationally, I find it interesting.
Yeah. Okay, probably we have some questions from auditorium. It's a good moment to ask. It seems no questions, okay.
But I mean, just then to the same point. The problem then is the power Milei has to fight bureaucracy comes from a presidential system where this person gets the power. In most European countries, liberals are one of many parties, and usually not the biggest one. And usually ruling in a coalition. And that, as such, is not very appealing. I mean, the appealing as a populist that one person comes, has the solutions, and fights the elite is something where a coalition, a small member in a coalition government, automatically has to disappoint, no?
Sure, but then we have like, what is our theory of how the state should work in the next 50 to 100 years? Like, it
You
cannot be
should have this theory first.
not a theory first, but at least we should think about that question. Like, if I get now into like the German case is a perfect case to exemplify that. Now Germany enters into a coalition government again. Nothing will really happen, and the AfD is already overtaking it now #1 party. That was predictable from the start.
Yeah.
If the political center or like. Also liberal parties, again, I think most parties have a lot of liberal overlap, but the liberal center, if it doesn't have a good understanding of how it can make its institutions to deliver, then we can hand over to the populists directly. In Eastern Germany, they are approaching close to single majority in certain states.
Yeah.
Because the old paradigm doesn't deliver.
And how does this connect to the 2050 agenda? Because
We elaborated 4 scenarios. One of them is, as you mentioned.
yeah,
Right.
That the populists will take the stronger lead, or what was the scenario?
Yeah. Okay, so we 45 minutes speaking, so
yeah.
I guess it's a normal time for seminar lectures we pronounced at the beginning. So thank you for those who were with us, and thank you, Julius. Thank you, Sven. Good stay in Vilnius.
Thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye. Viso gero.